Hi, this is Ranae Whitaker, and my partners for this project are Hunter O'Brien and Makayla Jolley. Decided in 1819, McCulloch v. Maryland starts when the states had a bunch of unregulated currency. This was a huge concern to Congress and our system of federalism. So, in 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States. The states were not really fans of this new bank, and many questioned the constitutionality of it. They believed that Congress was overstepping its powers due to the fact that it was not explicitly stated in the Constitution. In 1818, Maryland decided that it was going to tax all banks chartered outside of their state, which just so happened to include the Second Bank of the United States. A banker named James McCulloch refused to pay this tax on behalf of the Baltimore branch of the Bank of the United States, and following that, Maryland filed a lawsuit.
In the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, the state of Maryland was the plaintiff. The state had two main arguments that they used in the case for why the Second Bank of the United States should be unconstitutional and why they thought they should be able to tax it, even though it's a national bank and not a state bank. The first reason was because the Constitution was ratified by the states, and therefore the Constitution should serve the states and not the federal government. The second reason Maryland used was the 10th Amendment. They argue that because the Constitution did not explicitly mention that the federal government had the power to create a national bank, and that it was not an implied power, as a result, the power to create banks was reserved for the states. Luther Martin, who is one of the lawyers representing Maryland, said, "We insist that the only safe rule is the plain letter of the Constitution," which he used as a part of the argument in order to try and set a precedent that it is better to take the Constitution at face value and not to guess what the words in it mean.
McCulloch and his attorneys argued that the Bank of the United States was necessary and proper, authorized through the Elastic Clause, also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, written in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. They argued that the bank couldn't be taxed by the state because of the Supremacy Clause, which rules that the federal government laws are superior to state government laws.
In this case, the Supreme Court believed that Congress had the powers that were necessary to create the bank under the Necessary and Proper Clause, and therefore this power was an implied one, not strictly mentioned in the Constitution. They believed that America needed this bank, and therefore it was necessary and okay for Congress to create it. They also established that the states were unable to tax the federal government due to the Supremacy Clause, which essentially puts the federal government over the state government in the hierarchy of law. The Chief Justice on this case was John Marshall, who many are familiar with, who took a push, and the judges had a unanimous decision with a vote count of 7-0.
One reason why McCulloch v. Maryland was a very important case in history is this case gave the Elastic Clause more strength to be used for future cases in determining whose decisions are superior. The case established how much power the federal government has and determined more implied powers that the federal government can act upon. We continue to see the effects of this case today through the rulings given by our Supreme Court and help bring around the type of federalism used today in our government.
Some other reasons that this court case was important was because it established that the federal government was superior to the states. It also established that the federal government, even though it ruled over the states, was to work with the states. The ironic part about the ruling in this case is that it was originally thought that the most important part was that the Second Bank of the United States was constitutional and allowed to be created by the federal government. This is ironic because 14 years later, in 1833, the Jackson administration announced that the Second Bank of the United States would no longer be used, and in 1841, the bank underwent liquidation. Hindsight really is 20/20 because during the case, the focus was all about the constitutionality of the bank, and looking back, the main focus is on the precedents and the Supreme Court's arguments, and almost little to no emphasis on the actual Second Bank of the United States.